The courage to be disliked. There are two kinds of people in this world: those who live to be loved and those who live to be free. Most of us spend our lives chasing approval, wanting to be accepted, respected, noticed. We dress the way others like, speak the way society approves, and hide the parts of ourselves that don't fit in. We call it fitting in, but slowly it becomes a prison. A prison built not of walls, but of opinions, not of chains, but of fear. This is the story of one man who wanted to break free from that invisible prison, a young man full of anger, insecurity, and questions, and an old philosopher who claimed that true happiness comes from the courage to be disliked. Their conversation became a timeless lesson, a map that leads to freedom, peace, and the quiet strength of being yourself. This is not a book about pleasing others. It is about reclaiming your life. It is about the power of saying, I am enough. So take a deep breath, leave the noise of the world behind, and step into a quiet night, where an impatient young man meets a calm philosopher and discovers that happiness was never lost, only hidden behind fear. Title Whisper: The Courage to be Disliked by Ichiro Kashimi and Fumitake Koga. Chapter 1. The Youth Seeks the Truth. The night was quiet. A faint wind whispered through the paper windows, and the philosopher's small study glowed with the soft light of a single lamp. There was a knock at the door. A young man entered. Restless, angry, his eyes full of confusion. He had heard stories of the philosopher who claimed that happiness is a choice. To him, that sounded absurd. He bowed quickly, not out of respect, but irritation. Tell me, he said sharply, how can you say that happiness is a choice when the world is so unfair? The philosopher smiled gently. He motioned for the young man to sit. Outside, the crickets sang. The unbelievable claim. You believe, the philosopher said, that people are unhappy because of the past, their childhood, their trauma, their failures. The youth nodded. We are all products of our past. My life is shaped by what I've been through. The philosopher shook his head slowly. No, you are not determined by your past. You are shaped by the meaning you give to it now. The young man frowned. That makes no sense. You're saying my experiences don't matter? They matter, said the philosopher, but only if you let them define you. You are not driven by the past. You are pulled by your goals. The room fell silent. For a start, the youth had never heard such an idea before. The birth of a new thought. The philosopher continued softly. There are two kinds of psychology. One believes the past controls you. The other believes you are free to choose who you become. This idea, he said, comes from the teachings of Alfred Adler, a man who believed that the greatest freedom is the courage to be disliked. The youth laughed bitterly. To be disliked? Who wants that? Everyone wants approval, respect, love. The philosopher smiled. Yes, and that is why most people are not free. He leaned closer. Think about it. How much of what you do each day is for others to like you? How often do you act to fit in, to please, to avoid rejection? That is the invisible cage of your life. The youth fell silent. Somewhere deep inside, those words hurt, because they were true. The wall of blame. The philosopher poured tea. Tell me, he said, why do you think you are unhappy? The young man listed his reasons. His parents didn't understand him. His job wasn't fulfilling. Society was corrupt. Life was unfair. The philosopher listened quietly, then asked, So it is always someone else's fault? The youth bristled. That's not fair. The philosopher nodded. Exactly. Life is not fair, but it is still yours. He paused. As long as you blame others, you give away your power. You hand your freedom to those you accuse. The youth stared into his teacup. What am I supposed to do then? Forgive everyone? No, said the philosopher. Simply accept that they are them, and you are you. Your task is not to fix them. It is to live your own life. The principle of separation of tasks. Every person, the philosopher said, has their own tasks in life, things they are responsible for, and things they are not. Suffering begins when you cross into another's task. The youth tilted his head. I don't understand. The philosopher explained, for example, your parents want you to succeed in a certain way. That is their wish, but it is not your task. Your task is to decide how to live your own life. The young man thought of the expectations on his shoulders, his father's ambition, his mother's constant worry. He had always felt trapped by their hopes. The philosopher's words struck him like a quiet thunder. Live for your own task, the old man said, not the life others demand of you. the first glimpse of freedom. The young man asked, "But isn't that selfish?" The philosopher smiled softly. "To live freely is not to harm others. It is to be honest about your own path." He stood and opened the window. The cool night air flowed in. "Look at the stars," he said. "They shine without asking permission. They do not compete, yet all together they create the beauty of the sky." The young man followed his gaze. For a brief moment, he felt something new. A strange, light sensation he couldn't name. Perhaps it was peace. Perhaps it was freedom. The philosopher whispered, "When you stop living for approval, you start living for truth." The lesson of the first night. As the young man prepared to leave, the philosopher said quietly, "You believe you are unhappy because of your past, but the truth is, you choose to stay unhappy because it protects you." The youth turned sharply. "What do you mean?" The philosopher looked into his eyes. "As long as you blame others, you never have to change. It is easier to stay angry than to be free." The young man said nothing. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of night flowers. He bowed slightly, and for the first time, he bowed with respect. As he stepped into the dark street, the philosopher's final words followed him like a whisper. Open quote, "Happiness is not given. It is created the moment you take responsibility for your own life." Chapter 2. Trauma, Freedom, and the Trap of the Past. The night was still. The young man returned to the philosopher's home, his eyes filled with defiance and confusion. The old man greeted him with a smile, as though he had been expecting him all along. The young man wasted no time. He said, "You speak of freedom and happiness as if anyone can choose them. But how can I be free when my past has already decided who I am? My childhood, my failures, my pain, they shaped me. Don't you see? I can't just erase them." The philosopher looked at him quietly for a moment, then replied softly, "You are not controlled by your past. You are controlled by the story you tell about your past." The young man frowned. "What does that mean?" "My story is my truth. I suffered. I was ignored, humiliated, rejected. That is what made me who I am today." The philosopher nodded. "Indeed, those things happened, but you are the one deciding what they mean to you now. The past does not have power. The interpretation of the past does." The young man crossed his arms. "So you're saying trauma doesn't exist?" The philosopher smiled. "No, I'm saying it doesn't determine you. You have experienced pain, yes, but you are not defined by it. You are defined by how you use it." The young man shook his head. "That sounds nice in theory, but real pain leaves scars. I can't just decide to be someone else." The philosopher leaned forward. "Then tell me, when you say I can't, what you truly mean is I won't. You have chosen to believe that your past controls you because it is easier than taking responsibility for your present." The young man's voice rose. "That's not fair. You don't know what I've been through." "I don't need to," the philosopher said calmly, "because no matter what happened, the only question that matters now is this. What are you doing with it?" The young man paused, his breath heavy. The philosopher continued, "When you say, I am this way because of my parents or because of my childhood, you are giving your power away. You are saying, I cannot change. But that is not truth. It is fear disguised as logic. The past is over. It cannot touch you unless you invite it." The young man sat in silence, staring at the floor. The philosopher spoke gently. "You believe your life is a straight line, beginning at your birth and shaped by every event since. But life is not a line. It is a moment. This one, right now. You are not traveling from past to future. You are always standing here, in the present, choosing." The young man's voice softened. "So you're saying my past has no meaning?" "Not at all," said the philosopher. "It has meaning, the meaning you give it. You can make your pain a reason to hate or a reason to heal. You can make it a chain, or you can make it a teacher. That is your choice. That is your freedom." The young man looked at him, confused but curious. "If that's true, then why do people cling to their trauma?" "Because the pain is familiar," said the philosopher, "and the familiar feels safe, even when it hurts. To let go of pain is to face the unknown. Many would rather live in the certainty of suffering than the risk of peace." The young man sighed deeply. "Then what do I do? How do I stop being trapped by my past?" The philosopher answered, "You stop using it as an excuse. You stop saying, I am this way because of what happened, and start asking, what can I do now?" Every time you choose responsibility over blame, you take a step toward freedom. The young man was silent for a long time. Then, with a faint voice, he said, "But if I am not shaped by my past, then who am I?" The philosopher smiled again. "You are who you decide to be in this moment. Not yesterday, not 10 years ago, now." The young man leaned back, lost in thought. He had always believed his pain was his identity, that without it, he was nothing. But now a strange idea began to form. What if he could exist beyond his pain? What if freedom wasn't about escaping the past, but about no longer serving it? The philosopher spoke again. "You see, it's not what happened that defines us, but what we choose to believe about what happened. Two people can live through the same storm. One becomes bitter, the other becomes wise. The difference is not the storm, but the choice." The young man looked up slowly. "So happiness is a choice?" "Yes," the philosopher said softly, "and so is misery. You can't change the events of your life, but you can change the purpose you assign them. When you stop saying, 'I can't,' and start asking, 'How can I?' you begin to heal." The young man closed his eyes. For the first time, he noticed how tightly he had been gripping his pain, as if it were proof of something. Proof that he was right to suffer. He realized that he could let go if only he dared. The philosopher's voice was calm, almost like a whisper. "Your trauma does not define you. It happened, yes, but you are not what happened. You are what you decide to become after it." The young man opened his eyes. "Then, you're saying I can change my life now?" The philosopher smiled. "Yes, right now. Because freedom doesn't begin when the past disappears. It begins the moment you decide it no longer controls you." The young man fell silent, and in that silence, something inside him began to shift. Not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly, like the slow cracking of dawn. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his past begin to lift. Not because it vanished, but because he no longer needed it to explain who he was. Chapter 3. The Freedom to Choose Your Life. The morning light spilled softly through the paper windows. The young man sat again across from the philosopher, this time quieter than before. Something inside him had shifted. The anger that once burned in his voice was now replaced by something gentler, confusion mixed with curiosity. He finally spoke. "If my past doesn't decide who I am, then who does? If I can't blame what's behind me, what remains to guide me forward?" The philosopher smiled faintly. "You do," he said. "You, and only you." The young man frowned. "That sounds simple, but it isn't. People don't get to choose where they're born, who raises them, what hardships they face. How can you call that freedom?" The philosopher looked toward the morning sky. "You are right. We cannot choose the circumstances of our birth. But freedom is not about what you cannot choose. It is about what you can. And what you can always choose is your direction. How you respond, how you live, and what kind of meaning you give to your days." The young man stared at the ground. "So I'm supposed to pretend my problems don't exist?" "Not pretend," the philosopher said calmly. "Understand them, accept them, and then act despite them." He continued, "We are not puppets pulled by the strings of fate. We are authors, writing the story of our own lives. But most people forget that. They think their story is being written for them, by parents, society, or destiny. So they wait. They wait for change, for miracles, for permission. And in that waiting, life passes quietly by." The young man's brows tightened. "But some people have more choices than others. Some are born rich, others poor. Some are healthy, others sick. Surely not everyone is equally free." The philosopher nodded. "Yes, our starting points differ. But freedom begins not in what we have, but in how we see. Two men can face the same wall. One sees a dead end, the other sees a surface to climb. What you call limitation is often a reflection of your own belief about what's possible." The young man sighed. "So, you're saying if I just think differently, my life will change?" The philosopher smiled again. "Not just think, choose. Thinking changes nothing without decision. Decision creates movement, and movement brings transformation." He leaned forward slightly. When a bird is trapped in a cage for years, and one day the door opens, it doesn't fly away immediately, it hesitates. It has forgotten what freedom feels like. You are like that bird. The door has always been open, but fear has made you believe it's still locked. The young man sat silently, hearing his own thoughts echo. For so long he had lived believing that everything, his pain, his failures, his limits were walls built by life. Now, for the first time, he wondered if he had built them himself. The philosopher continued, "You see, freedom is not something others give you. It is something you realize you already have. But with freedom comes responsibility, the kind that frightens people. Because once you accept that your life is your choice, you lose the right to blame anyone else for it." The young man's voice grew quiet. "Responsibility? That's the part that scares me. If I fail, it's my fault. If I suffer, it's because of my decisions. Maybe it's easier to believe I'm not free." The philosopher nodded gently. "Yes. That is why so many people choose bondage over freedom. It's comfortable to say, I can't. It's harder to say, I choose not to. But every time you refuse responsibility, you give a piece of your freedom away." The young man looked thoughtful. "Then what does it mean to live freely?" "To live freely," said the philosopher, "is to stop chasing approval and start living by your own values. Freedom is not doing whatever you want. It's doing what truly matters to you, even if others disapprove." The young man tilted his head. "So, to be free, I must stop caring what people think?" "Not stop caring," the philosopher said softly, "but stop living for it. When your happiness depends on the opinions of others, you are not free. You are a slave to their moods, their judgments, their praise. Freedom begins the moment you stop performing and start living honestly." The young man was quiet for a long while. Then he asked, "But what if being myself hurts people? What if my truth disappoints them?" The philosopher looked at him with kind eyes. "That may happen. But remember, to live a life that pleases everyone is to live a life that belongs to no one. You cannot walk two paths at once. You can only walk your own." The young man frowned slightly. "But what about love, friendship, family? Don't we need to care what others feel?" "Yes," said the philosopher, "but not at the cost of your own soul. True love does not demand you to sacrifice your freedom. It invites you to share it. If your relationships require you to betray yourself, they are not built on love. They are built on control." The young man took a deep breath. His heart felt both lighter and heavier. He began to see that the price of freedom was not small. It demanded honesty, courage, and the willingness to stand alone if needed. He whispered, "So freedom is not happiness, it's responsibility." The philosopher smiled. "Exactly. Freedom is not a comfortable gift. It's a burden that only the brave can carry. But once you do, you discover that responsibility is not heavy. It's liberating. Because when you take full ownership of your life, you also gain full power to change it." The young man sat quietly, absorbing each word. His eyes softened as though seeing the world with new light. He thought about how often he had blamed others, his parents, his teachers, his past. How often he had waited for someone to rescue him, to understand him, to tell him what to do. And now he realized that no one else could do that. The map was in his hands all along. The philosopher broke the silence. "You can spend your life fighting for control over things you cannot change, or you can master the one thing that was always yours. Your choice." The young man nodded slowly. "It sounds simple," he said, "but it feels like learning to breathe for the first time." The philosopher smiled again. "It is. Every breath, every thought, every moment, all of them are small acts of choice. Freedom is not a one-time revelation. It's a habit, a daily practice, and every time you choose to live by your own truth, your chains fall away a little more." The young man looked out the window. The sky was turning gold now. The day was beginning. For the first time, he didn't feel like a victim of his story. He felt like the writer. And in that quiet realization, freedom was no longer a distant dream. It was a quiet presence, alive, steady, waiting for him to walk with it. Chapter 4. Why You Don't Need to Seek Approval. The evening returned again, quiet and golden, the same way it always did in the philosopher's home. The young man came, slower this time, not rushing with arguments, but carrying a question that had been echoing in his mind for days. He sat down and spoke softly. "All my life," he said, "I've wanted to be seen, to be accepted. I've worked hard, not just to succeed, but to be liked. And when people don't like me, it hurts more than failure itself. How do I stop caring about what others think? It's not easy." The philosopher nodded. "No, it isn't easy," he said. "Because from the moment we are born, we depend on others to tell us who we are. Parents praise or scold us. Teachers approve or reject us. Society sets rules and expectations. Slowly, we begin to measure our worth by the reactions of others. We forget how to live for ourselves. The young man leaned forward. But isn't it natural to want people's approval? We live in a world of relationships. If I stop caring, won't I become selfish? The philosopher smiled gently. There is a difference between caring and depending. You can love others, you can respect them, but the moment your peace depends on their opinion, you have given away your freedom. The young man looked puzzled. So, how do I tell the difference? The philosopher replied, when your heart is at peace, even if someone disapproves, you are free. When your heart imbues with fear of judgment, you are still a prisoner. The young man sat back, thinking. He realized that much of what he did, his achievements, his choices, even his dreams, were shaped not by what he truly wanted, but by what others expected of him. He said quietly, I think I've never really lived for myself. I've only lived to be seen as good. The philosopher nodded. That is the disease of our time. People chase praise like beggars chasing coins. They build their self-worth on the applause of others, and when the applause stops, they crumble. The young man asked, Then what should I live for? The philosopher replied softly, For truth, for what makes your heart peaceful, for what remains even when no one is watching. The young man frowned. But if I stop seeking approval, won't I lose connection with people? Won't they think I've become arrogant or cold? Some might, the philosopher said, because when you stop trying to please everyone, you stop fitting into the expectations they have built for you. But that is not arrogance. That is authenticity. And true connection can only exist between honest souls. The young man looked uncertain. But rejection hurts. Yes, said the philosopher. It hurts because you believe rejection means you are unworthy. But rejection is not a reflection of your value. It is a reflection of difference. Not everyone will understand you, and they don't have to. What matters is that you understand yourself. The young man sighed. Still, I can't deny that I want people to like me. The philosopher smiled. We all do. But remember this. When you try to be liked by everyone, you lose yourself. And even if everyone approves of you, what good is their love if it's for someone you're pretending to be? The young man went silent. His thoughts ran deep. He began to see how his constant desire for approval had exhausted him, how it made him change his words, his clothes, even his dreams, just to fit in. The philosopher continued, There's a simple truth. You cannot control what others think of you. You can be kind, honest, and true, and still someone will dislike you. So why waste your short life chasing something that was never yours to control? The young man stared at him. Then, what should I do when people judge me unfairly? Smile, said the philosopher, because their judgment tells you about them, not you. And remember, no one's approval can replace your own peace of mind. If you live for their applause, you'll die with their silence. The young man looked down. It sounds so easy when you say it, but in reality, it's hard. I care too much about how others see me. The philosopher leaned forward. Let me tell you something. When you walk down a street and someone stares at you, you start to feel uneasy, don't you? The young man nodded. That uneasiness comes from a story in your head, the philosopher said. You assume they're judging you, laughing at you, thinking something bad. But in truth, they may not be thinking of you at all. The world does not revolve around you. Most people are too busy thinking about themselves. The moment you realize that, the world becomes lighter. The young man was quiet, then slowly smiled. So all this time, I've been living in a world built from my own fears. The philosopher nodded. Exactly. You created a mirror world, one where every reflection was distorted by your need for approval. The only way to break free is to stop looking for mirrors and start looking within. The young man took a deep breath. But if I live only for myself, how do I know what's right? How do I make decisions? The philosopher answered by asking one simple question. Does this bring me peace? Not excitement, not pride, peace. Because peace is the voice of truth within you. Approval is loud, but peace is silent. Learn to follow the silence. The young man felt those words sink deep into his heart. He realized how noisy his mind had become, crowded with opinions, expectations, and fears. He had mistaken that noise for direction. Now he could almost hear the stillness beneath it. The philosopher's voice softened. There will always be people who misunderstand you. But remember, no one else can walk your path. And those who truly care for you will stay, not because you pleased them, but because you were real with them. The young man looked up, his eyes clearer now. So to live freely, I must stop seeking approval and start living truthfully? The philosopher smiled. Yes. To be free is not to be careless. It is to be authentic. When you live truthfully, you may lose some people, but you'll find yourself. And that is a trade worth making. The young man nodded slowly. Something deep within him shifted once again. He realized that peace wasn't found in being liked, but in being honest. That love without truth was only illusion. He whispered, "Maybe for the first time, I understand what courage really means." The philosopher asked, "And what does it mean to you now?" The young man smiled faintly. "It means having the courage to be disliked and still live with peace." The philosopher's eyes softened, full of warmth. "Then, my friend," he said, "you are beginning to live." And in that small, quiet room, something invisible yet powerful began to take root in the young man's heart. A kind of calm strength that did not depend on praise or acceptance. He no longer needed the world's approval to feel alive, because now, for the first time, he was learning to approve of himself. Chapter 5. Separating Tasks. The Secret to Inner Peace. The next time the young man arrived, he looked calmer than before. He no longer carried the same heaviness in his steps. Yet, behind his eyes, there was still a flicker of restlessness, as though he had discovered peace, but was still afraid of losing it. He sat down across from the philosopher, quietly for a moment, then said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about not needing approval. I tried it. I stopped explaining myself to people. I tried to live more honestly. But it's hard. People misunderstand me, criticize me, call me selfish. I want to stay calm, but I still feel angry when they don't see what I mean." The philosopher nodded gently, as if he had been expecting this. "That's because you are still trying to control something that does not belong to you," he said. The young man frowned. "What do you mean?" The philosopher smiled. "You are still trying to control other people's thoughts, feelings, and reactions. That is not your task." The young man tilted his head. "My task?" "Yes," the philosopher replied. "This is what we call separating tasks. It means understanding clearly what is your responsibility and what is not." The young man leaned forward, curious. The philosopher continued, "Most of the pain in life comes from confusing these tasks. We spend our days worrying about what others think, trying to fix how they feel, trying to make them approve of us or act as we wish. But none of that is ours to control. Our only task is to choose our own actions, with sincerity and honesty. What others do with those actions is their task, not ours." The young man sat in silence, letting the words sink in. The philosopher went on, "For example, when you study hard and do your best on an exam, your task is the effort, not the result. The grading is the teacher's task. Whether they praise you or not, whether you get a high mark or not, that no longer belongs to you once you have done your part." The young man nodded slowly. The philosopher continued, "When you are kind to someone, your task ends with your kindness. Whether they respond with gratitude or ignore you completely, that is their task. You have no control over it." The young man looked puzzled. "But if we stop caring about how people respond, won't that make us cold?" The philosopher shook his head. "On the contrary, it will make you warm in the right way. You will give without expectation, love without fear, act without anxiety, because your peace will no longer depend on someone else's reaction." The young man lowered his gaze. "I see. I've always cared too much about how people respond. I guess I thought their reaction determined my worth." The philosopher's voice softened. "Exactly. But your worth is not something that can be measured by another person's mood. Once you separate your tasks from theirs, you begin to see how much unnecessary pain you've been carrying." The young man thought for a moment. "So, if someone hates me or misunderstands me, that's not my problem?" "That's right," said the philosopher. "It's their task to decide what they think, and it's your task to decide whether you will let that thought control your peace." The young man smiled faintly. "Then I suppose, when I try to make everyone like me, I'm doing their task, not mine." The philosopher smiled too. "Exactly. When you live trying to be liked, you've stepped into a world you cannot control, and the more you try, the more you suffer. But when you simply live by your own principles, you leave their feelings to them, and peace returns to you. The young man took a deep breath. That sounds simple, but people might still say I'm being rude or distant if I stop trying to please them. The philosopher nodded. Yes, some might. But remember this, your life is not a performance for others. You are not living to meet expectations that were never yours to begin with. You are living to fulfill your own potential, to do the tasks that belong to you. He paused, then added, freedom without boundaries becomes chaos. But when you learn where your responsibility ends, you also discover where peace begins. The young man leaned back, thinking deeply. So, separating tasks means focusing only on what I can truly control. My choices, my effort, my attitude, and leaving the rest to others. The philosopher nodded with a calm smile. That is the essence of inner peace, because the moment you stop trying to control the uncontrollable, life becomes lighter. The young man thought back to his many arguments, disappointments, and regrets, all the times he had tried to make people understand him or force situations to go his way. Every time it ended in frustration. And now, for the first time, he understood why. He whispered, maybe that's why I've been so tired all my life. I've been living other people's tasks without realizing it. The philosopher nodded softly. Yes, when you spend your energy on tasks that are not yours, you lose sight of yourself. You become trapped in an endless attempt to please or control others. But when you begin to see clearly what belongs to you and what doesn't, your life becomes simple. Not easy, but simple. The young man smiled faintly. And maybe that's what happiness is, a simple life. The philosopher's eyes glowed with warmth. Happiness is clarity, to know where your power lies and where it does not, to stop fighting every wind that blows and instead adjust your sails. The young man sat quietly, thinking of all the storms he had faced and how many of them he had created in his own mind. He said softly, it's strange. I thought peace was something to find, but it feels like it was always here, waiting for me to stop fighting. The philosopher smiled. That's exactly it. Peace is not something you seek. It's what remains when you stop doing the things that disturb it. The young man nodded slowly. For a moment, there was silence, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full, like the pause between heartbeats. He finally said, so from now on, I'll focus only on my tasks, not theirs. The philosopher smiled. And that, my friend, is the beginning of freedom that cannot be shaken by anyone. And in that moment, the young man felt something loosen inside him, a rope he had been unknowingly pulling all his life. It fell away quietly, leaving behind not excitement, but stillness. He had discovered the truth hidden in simplicity, that the secret to peace is not control, but clarity. Chapter 6. Living without comparison, the weight we choose to carry. The evening air was cool when the young man arrived again. He sat quietly, his hands folded, eyes thoughtful. There was no anger in him this time, only a kind of fragile curiosity, like someone slowly learning to breathe after a long swim. I've been practicing separating tasks, he said softly. It's strange, I feel lighter. But sometimes, when I see others doing better, my friends getting promotions, finding love, becoming successful, I can't help but compare. I know it's not my task, but I still feel left behind. The philosopher nodded. That feeling is common. But tell me, when you compare yourself to another, what do you gain? The young man hesitated. Nothing. Only pain. The philosopher leaned back in his chair. Then perhaps it's time to stop measuring your life by someone else's yardstick. The young man frowned. But if we don't compare, how do we improve? How do we know if we're progressing? The philosopher smiled gently. Progress is not a race. It's a direction. Comparison destroys direction because it turns your eyes away from your own path. He paused, letting the words breathe. In this world, he continued, no two people have walked the same road. Each life is built upon unique experiences, choices, and circumstances. To compare your journey to another's is like comparing the moon to the sea. Both shine, both are beautiful, but each follows a different rhythm. The young man sat still, listening. The philosopher continued, his voice steady and calm. Adler taught that people suffer not because they lack ability, but because they see life as a competition. They believe they must prove their worth by being better than others. But life is not an arena. It's a field where we cultivate our own soil. Some grow flowers, others fruit. You cannot compare a rose to a tree." The young man smiled faintly, but the world doesn't see it that way. Everyone talks about winning, achieving, being first. If you stop comparing, won't you fall behind? The philosopher shook his head slowly. Fall behind whom? There is no finish line. No one is chasing you, and no one is waiting at the end to hand out medals. He leaned forward slightly. The only question that matters is this: are you walking your path sincerely? Are you doing what gives your life meaning, not someone else's? The young man took a deep breath. It's difficult. Since childhood, we're told to be better than others. Better grades, better job, better everything. It's like our worth depends on how far ahead we stand. The philosopher nodded. Yes, that is the lie that keeps most people running forever without rest. They run and run, yet the goal always moves further away. Because comparison is a race with no end. He paused again, then said softly, "Let me ask you something. When you were a child, did you ever climb a tree?" The young man smiled. Yes, many times. When you reached the top, the philosopher asked, did you look down at the other children and think, I am better than them? Or did you simply enjoy the view? The young man thought for a moment, then laughed quietly. I just enjoyed it. I never thought of being better. I was happy I made it. The philosopher smiled. That is the natural state of life, joy without comparison. But as we grow, we forget. We start climbing trees not to see the sky, but to prove we can climb higher than someone else. He leaned closer. And in that moment, the joy disappears. Because now, your happiness depends not on the climb, but on others falling behind. The young man's smile faded into thought. So comparison is what takes away the joy of the climb. Exactly, said the philosopher. When you stop comparing, you rediscover the beauty of your own progress, even if it's slow. You begin to appreciate small steps, quiet victories, and moments of rest. Life becomes yours again. The young man nodded slowly. But sometimes I look at people who have achieved so much more. Fame, money, recognition. It's hard not to feel small. The philosopher replied, You feel small only because you are using their light to measure your shadow. Stop looking outward, and you will see that your path is not dark. It's simply different. He continued, Those who live by comparison never find peace, because there will always be someone ahead. Even if you reach the top, you'll find another mountain, another climber higher than you. The cycle never ends. The philosopher paused, then said quietly, True freedom is when you no longer need to be superior to anyone. You simply are. The young man stared at the floor. Then what should I aim for, if not to be better? The philosopher smiled gently. Aim to be useful. Not superior, but helpful. Do not compete with others. Contribute to life. A flower does not compare itself to another. It just blooms. And in doing so, it makes the garden beautiful. The young man looked up, his eyes softening. So instead of asking, am I better than them? I should ask, what can I give? Precisely, said the philosopher. When you start asking that question, comparison disappears. Because now, your life is measured not by others, but by the light you bring to them. The philosopher looked toward the fading light outside. The world teaches us to chase success, but success is fragile. Contribution, however, lasts beyond you. When you live to give, you are never behind because your purpose is infinite. The young man exhaled slowly, almost smiling. Then maybe happiness begins the moment we stop racing. The philosopher nodded. Yes, happiness begins when you stop trying to stand above others and simply walk beside them. He paused again, his voice lowering to a calm whisper. Look at the sky tonight. Every star shines differently. None is trying to outshine another, yet together they make the night beautiful. That is life without comparison. The young man sat silently, feeling something ease inside him, a kind of peace that came not from winning, but from no longer needing to. For the first time in a long while, he felt free to walk his own pace. And as the night deepened, he understood that the weight he had been carrying, the need to be better, to prove, to compare, had never been placed upon him by the world. He had chosen it. And now, he could choose to put it down. Chapter 7. Living in harmony with others. The quiet strength of connection. The next evening, the young man returned earlier than usual. The sky was painted in soft orange and gold, and a calm wind passed through the garden as he entered. The philosopher was already there, sitting with a book on his lap, smiling as if he had been waiting. The young man bowed slightly before sitting. "I've been thinking," he began, "about what you said last time. That happiness begins when we stop racing. I feel lighter, yes, but I still struggle when it comes to people. I want to live freely, but when I do, others get angry or disappointed. How can I be free without hurting them? How can I live peacefully with others?" The philosopher closed the book and looked at him kindly. "Ah," he said softly, "that is the next step. Learning to live in harmony without losing yourself." He paused, then asked, "Tell me, what do you think harmony means?" The young man frowned and thought, "I suppose it means getting along with people, avoiding conflict, trying to make everyone happy." The philosopher smiled gently. "That's what most people think. But that's not harmony, that's compliance." The young man looked up, surprised. "Compliance?" "Yes," said the philosopher. "Harmony is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of respect. To live in harmony, you must first accept that everyone has their own rhythm, their own way of being. You don't have to match their beat, only listen without judgment." He leaned back, eyes drifting toward the fading light outside. Most of our pain in relationships comes from wanting others to be what they are not. We want them to think as we do, act as we wish, and feel as we expect. But when they don't, we feel betrayed. The young man nodded slowly. "That's true. I often wish people would just understand me." The philosopher smiled. "And they wish the same. That's the beginning of conflict, when both people want to be understood, but neither listens." He continued, "You see, to live in harmony with others, you must first give up the desire to control them. When you stop expecting people to move according to your tune, you begin to hear the music of life as it truly is, imperfect, unpredictable, and beautiful." The young man looked down, thoughtful. "But what if someone mistreats me? Should I just accept it and stay calm?" The philosopher shook his head. "No, harmony does not mean being silent in the face of wrong. It means responding, not reacting. You can refuse what's unjust without anger. You can draw boundaries without hatred." He paused for a moment, letting the thought settle. "When you respond from calmness, not fear, you protect your peace and theirs. That is harmony, not submission, not defiance, but balance." The young man sighed quietly. "I see, but sometimes I think people misunderstand kindness. They take advantage of it. They think being calm means being weak." The philosopher smiled again. "Only those who are at war within themselves mistake calmness for weakness. True strength is quiet. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to prove. Like a deep river, it flows steadily, even when stones are thrown into it." He picked up a small leaf from the table and held it between his fingers. "Do you see this leaf? It bends in the wind, but it doesn't break. It's flexible, and that's what keeps it alive. Human relationships are the same. You cannot live without bending sometimes. But you must never forget your root, your values, your self-respect." The young man smiled faintly. "So I can be kind without surrendering my truth." "Yes," said the philosopher. "That is harmony, the dance between staying true to yourself and being gentle with others." He continued, "Most people think love and harmony come from being needed, but that's not love. That's dependency. True love appears when both people can stand alone and still choose to stand together." The young man nodded slowly. "So I shouldn't try to make others depend on me?" "Exactly," said the philosopher. "You should aim to empower them, help them grow, not cling. When you love without wanting to possess, when you care without wanting control, your relationships become lighter. Like two birds flying side by side, not chained together." He smiled gently. "And the same goes for family, friends, or even strangers. You can wish them well without needing their approval. You can forgive them without forgetting your worth." The young man leaned back, a quiet calm in his face. "It sounds peaceful, but I still wonder. What if others don't like how I live? What if they keep judging me?" The philosopher looked at him with kind eyes. "Then let them judge. Their judgment is their story, not yours. You cannot control how others see you. You can only control how you see them." He paused, then added softly, "When you stop trying to correct everyone's opinion of you, you gain an incredible gift, serenity. And when you treat others as equals, not enemies, they begin to feel seen. That is how harmony grows." The young man's eyes softened. "So to live in harmony, I must first stop fighting. Not with others, but with reality. The philosopher nodded. Yes, harmony begins when you make peace with what is, with yourself, with the imperfection of others, with the world's unpredictability. When you stop resisting what you cannot change, your energy returns to where it belongs, living. He closed his eyes briefly, then said, "Remember this. Peace does not mean everyone agrees with you. It means you no longer need them to." The young man sat silently, letting the weight of those words settle deep inside. He realized that harmony was not something to be found in others. It was something to be cultivated within himself. And once it bloomed there, it would spread naturally to those around him. For the first time, he felt that maybe living peacefully with others was not about pleasing them, but about living so calmly, sincerely, that his presence itself became peace. Chapter 8. To be truly happy. Living for the present moment. It was a quiet night. The moon hung low, pale and round, resting just above the dark line of trees. The young man sat by the window of the philosopher's small house, watching the silver light spill across the floor. He seemed calm, but his eyes carried the weight of unspoken thought. "I've been thinking," he began softly, "about happiness. You've taught me about freedom, about harmony, about comparison, but happiness still feels distant, like something I can touch for a moment, and then it slips away." The philosopher, sitting nearby, poured tea into 2 small cups. The sound of the liquid was soft, almost musical. "Most people," he said, "spend their lives chasing happiness as if it were a bird they could catch. But happiness is not a thing to possess. It is a way of being." The young man took a cup and stared into the rising steam. "But then why does it vanish so easily?" The philosopher smiled gently. "Because you keep looking for it in the wrong place, in the future, or in the past. But happiness only exists now, in this moment." The young man looked up. "In the present?" "Yes," said the philosopher, "always in the present. But most people never truly live here. They live in yesterday's regrets, or tomorrow's hopes. They forget that the only time they can breathe, feel, and act is now." He leaned forward slightly. "Think of your mind as a room. When it's filled with old memories and worries of the future, there's no space left for the present. You must open the windows, let the past drift away, let the future wait outside. Then, and only then, can the air of now come in." The young man took a slow breath. "That's hard to do. My mind keeps wandering. I keep thinking about mistakes, about what I could have done differently." The philosopher nodded. "The mind loves to wander. It feeds on unfinished stories. But you can train it to return, just as you call a child back home. When your thoughts drift into yesterday, gently remind yourself that time no longer exists. You cannot step into it again, just as you cannot hold smoke in your hand." The young man smiled faintly. "And the future?" "The future," said the philosopher, "is a mirage. It keeps moving as you walk. You plan, you prepare, yes, but you must live as if today were the only certainty, because it is. The more you live for tomorrow, the more today slips away unnoticed." The philosopher's voice softened. "You see, people often say, 'When I achieve this, I'll be happy.' But the moment they achieve it, they move the goal further. They live like travelers chasing a sunset, never realizing they're already bathed in its light." The young man listened quietly, and after a long pause, he whispered, "So happiness isn't something to reach. It's something to feel right now." "Yes," said the philosopher. "Happiness is found in simple awareness. When you notice the taste of tea, the sound of wind, the warmth of your breath, that's happiness. It doesn't shout. It whispers." The young man chuckled softly. "That sounds too simple." The philosopher smiled. "It is simple, but simplicity is the hardest thing for a complicated mind. We've been taught that happiness must be earned, proven, deserved. But it isn't a prize. It's the natural state of a mind that's not tangled in fear or desire." He sipped his tea, then added, "Do you know why children laugh so freely?" The young man shook his head. "Because they live entirely in the moment. When they play, they forget the world. When they cry completely. When they laugh without restraint. Their joy is pure because their attention is pure." The philosopher's gaze softened. "But as we grow older, we learn to divide ourselves. We eat while worrying, talk while thinking of something else, work while dreaming of escape. Our body lives here, but our mind lives elsewhere. That separation is what we call unhappiness." The young man looked down at his tea, his reflection trembling in the surface. So to be happy, I must learn to live fully in whatever moment I am in. Yes, the philosopher said, to be here completely, even in pain, even in confusion, even in silence. Stay. Because when you stop running from the moment, you discover it is not your enemy. It's your teacher. The young man was silent for a while. The night deepened around them, soft and still. Then he said quietly, "But what about suffering? Can we still be happy when life hurts?" The philosopher's voice was gentle but firm. Suffering and happiness are not enemies. They are parts of the same truth. You cannot feel one deeply without knowing the other. To reject pain is to reject the depth of life itself. You must accept both, as the sky accepts both sun and storm. He leaned back and added, when you stop labeling moments as good or bad and instead experience them as they are, happiness grows quietly beneath everything. The young man took a deep breath. His shoulders seemed lighter, his eyes calmer. So happiness isn't something to find later. It's here, waiting beneath the noise. The philosopher smiled warmly. Exactly. You don't need to chase happiness. You need only to stop walking away from it. He looked out the window. Every sunrise, every breath, every small act of kindness, these are not steps toward happiness. They are happiness. You just have to notice. The young man followed his gaze to the night sky, where the moon hung steady among drifting clouds. For the first time, he didn't think of tomorrow or yesterday. He simply sat, feeling the quiet pulse of the moment, the warmth of the tea in his hand, the softness of his breath. And in that stillness, he realized something simple but vast. Happiness was not a reward waiting at the end of the path. It was the path. He smiled softly, and the philosopher nodded as if he had read his thoughts. There, he said quietly, now you understand. Chapter 9, Purpose Beyond Self, Living to Contribute. The next time the young man came, he walked more slowly than before. The restless energy that once surrounded him had softened. His steps were quieter, his gaze clearer. It was as if, little by little, the noise inside him had begun to fade. He greeted the philosopher with a slight bow and took his seat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable. Like two people sitting beside a gentle stream, listening to the sound of water instead of words. Finally, the young man said, "Lately, I've felt calmer. I don't get angry so easily. I don't compare myself to others so much. I even enjoy the small things, walking, reading, drinking tea." But he hesitated. Sometimes I wonder, is this all there is? Just living peacefully? Shouldn't life have a bigger purpose? The philosopher smiled. Ah, you have arrived at the question that waits for everyone who begins to find peace. Now that I am no longer fighting the world, what do I live for? The young man nodded. Exactly. When I stopped chasing approval, I thought I'd feel complete. But now I feel empty, like something is missing. The philosopher looked thoughtful. That emptiness, he said, is not a lack. It is space. And that space is asking you to fill it with meaning. When you stop living for others' praise, you must discover what you will live for instead. The young man frowned slightly. Then what should I live for? The philosopher looked up at the ceiling as though the answer was written there. To live for yourself, truly for yourself, is to live beyond yourself. The young man looked puzzled. That sounds contradictory, the philosopher smiled. It sounds that way only because we have been taught that living for others means sacrificing ourselves. But that's not what it means. Living for others does not mean losing yourself. It means extending yourself. He continued, his voice soft but sure. When a tree grows, it does not feed others out of duty. It simply becomes what it is, and in doing so, it gives shade, fruit, air, and beauty. That is contribution. The tree does not try to please anyone. It fulfills its purpose by being fully itself. The young man listened carefully. So, the philosopher said, when you develop your skills, your kindness, your understanding, not to prove your worth, but to share what you can, you begin to live a life that nourishes others. That is the beginning of true purpose. The young man thought for a while. So contribution is not about doing grand things? No, the philosopher replied. Most people misunderstand contribution. They imagine it as building empires, saving nations, writing books that change the world. But true contribution begins in the smallest acts. The way you speak kindly, the way you listen without judgment, the way you give your time, your care, your attention. Even a gentle word can change the course of someone's day, perhaps even their life. He paused and looked at the young man's face. To live for contribution means to ask each morning, "What can I give today?" instead of, "What will I get?" The young man looked down at his hands. "But isn't that exhausting, to always give?" The philosopher shook his head. "Giving that drains you is not real giving. It's sacrifice. Real contribution gives you energy. When you give from authenticity, from the heart, you feel full, not empty. Because in that moment, you are aligned with your nature. A bird does not tire of flying. It becomes what it was made to be." The young man smiled faintly. "I think I understand. You're saying purpose isn't about recognition. It's about expression." The philosopher's eyes brightened. "Yes. You live purposefully when you express your true nature in a way that serves life, however small the act. You don't need applause. The reward is the act itself." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, what brings you peace?" The young man hesitated, thinking. "When I help someone, when I teach, or even when I listen to a friend who's struggling, I feel useful." "Then there it is," the philosopher said softly. "That feeling of usefulness is the heartbeat of purpose. It's the universe whispering, 'This is what you're meant to do.'" He added, "Each person has their own way of contributing, some through art, some through kindness, some through patience, some through courage. It doesn't matter how small your role seems. What matters is that it's genuine." The young man looked thoughtful. "But what if I fail? What if my contribution doesn't change anything?" The philosopher smiled gently. "You're not responsible for the size of your impact, only for its sincerity. A single candle may not light the world, but it can still guide a traveler through darkness. You never know who your light will reach." The room fell quiet for a moment. The philosopher looked at the young man's face, softened by the glow of the lamp. "In the end," he said, "happiness and purpose are not two paths. They are one. The moment you begin to live for something beyond your own comfort, happiness follows naturally. It's not forced. It flows." The young man was silent for a while, absorbing the words. "So, to find happiness, I must stop asking, 'What do I need from life?' and start asking, 'What does life need from me?'" The philosopher nodded, his eyes shining. "Exactly. When you stop treating life as something that owes you joy and start treating it as something you serve with joy, everything changes." He continued, "Think of it this way. There are two ways to live. One is to see yourself as a drop of water in the ocean, small and separate. The other is to see that the ocean itself is made of drops like you. When you act with purpose, your drop ripples outward, and though you may not see where it reaches, it becomes part of something vast and beautiful." The young man smiled, his expression clear, serene. "So purpose isn't about me at all. It's about the whole." The philosopher nodded. "Yes, you are part of the world, not apart from it. To contribute is to remember that connection. When you do, you'll never feel alone." The young man sat back, feeling a quiet fullness within. The question that had troubled him, "What should I live for?" no longer seemed heavy. It had transformed into something lighter, something alive. He whispered, almost to himself, "To live is to give." The philosopher's face softened with warmth. "Yes," he said, "to live is to give, and to give is to live fully. That is the meaning of purpose. That is the secret of lasting happiness." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. The night felt calm, alive, infinite, as though the universe itself was listening. The young man looked out into the darkness, and for the first time, he did not feel small. He felt like part of something vast and quietly kind, something that did not need to be understood to be trusted. He smiled, and the philosopher smiled with him, both sitting in silence, not because there was nothing more to say, but because the truth had already been spoken. And in that silence, purpose and peace became the same thing. Chapter 10. The Courage to be Disliked, Becoming Truly Free. The night was quiet now. The same stars hung above the dark horizon, but something had changed. The young man who once stormed into the philosopher's small, dimly lit study was no longer the same. His voice, once filled with anger and restlessness, had softened. His eyes, once searching for a fight, now carried a strange calm. He sat across from the philosopher, silence resting between them like an old friend. At last, he spoke. "I understand now," he said quietly. "To live freely is not to be loved by everyone. It's to live without fear of not being loved. The philosopher nodded. Exactly. You've walked a long way to arrive here. The young man looked down at his hands. But still, it feels frightening. To live knowing others may hate me. To walk a path that no one else approves of. What if I lose everything? The philosopher smiled. Then you will finally find yourself. The words hung in the air like a lantern glow, warm and clear. Freedom, the philosopher explained, is never given. It is taken. It is the quiet decision to stop living through the eyes of others, to stop measuring your worth by the reactions you receive, to stop asking, what will they think of me? And instead ask, what do I think of myself? The young man leaned back, breathing deeply. For the first time, he realized how heavy that question truly was. He remembered all the years he had tried to please parents, teachers, friends, strangers. Every choice he made had been a performance. Every smile, a kind of mask. He was exhausted, not from living, but from acting. And in that exhaustion, he saw what the philosopher meant. To be disliked is not to be rejected. It is to be real. The philosopher spoke again, slowly, like waves touching the shore. When you decide to live your own life, you'll be misunderstood. Some will call you selfish. Some will walk away. But it's only because they see you stepping out of the game they still play, the game of pleasing and pretending. And when they see you free, they'll feel their own chains. That's why they resist you. That's why they dislike you. The young man looked up. So their dislike is not really about me. Exactly, said the philosopher. It's about the mirror you hold. When you live freely, you remind others that they too can choose. And not everyone is ready to face that. He thought about this in silence. The truth was both comforting and lonely. Freedom, he realized, comes with space, and space can feel like emptiness. But within that emptiness, something begins to grow. Strength, self-respect, and peace. The philosopher stood up and walked toward the open window. The night air was cool. True happiness, he said, is found when you no longer need to be special, when you no longer need to stand above or below anyone else. You simply are, as you are. The young man followed him to the window. Below, the city lights blinked like quiet fires, each one representing a life, each one struggling, hoping, searching. I used to think, the young man said, that I needed to prove myself, that life was a competition, but now I see there's nothing to win. Nothing to win, the philosopher repeated softly, only to live. They stood together for a while, watching the night, and in that stillness, a deep understanding settled in. You cannot please everyone. You cannot control how others see you. You cannot escape judgment, gossip, or rejection. But you can choose how to live. You can choose honesty over approval, truth over comfort, and peace over noise. That is the courage to be disliked. Not rebellion, not arrogance, but quiet acceptance of yourself. To wake each day, look at your reflection, and say, I am enough. The philosopher turned toward the young man one last time. Your life is yours. No one can walk it for you. So walk proudly, even when no one walks beside you. The young man smiled, not the polite smile he once wore, but a simple, peaceful one. He bowed to the philosopher, not out of formality, but gratitude. When he stepped outside, the dawn was beginning to rise. The air was fresh, cool, alive. The world looked the same, yet entirely new. For the first time, he wasn't trying to be liked. He wasn't trying to be understood. He was simply living. And that was freedom. Epilogue: The Quiet Revolution Within. The sun had already risen when the young man walked home. The sky was painted in slow shades of gold, melting into blue. The world around him looked the same streets, the same trees, the same distant noise of waking life. But inside, something was entirely different. He could feel the quiet hum of peace under his skin, like a soft vibration. For years, he had believed that happiness was somewhere out there, hidden in the approval of others, in success, in praise, in love. Now he realized happiness had been waiting inside him all along, silenced only by the noise of trying too hard. He remembered the philosopher's words. You do not live to satisfy others' expectations. You live your own life, and others live theirs. Each step he took felt lighter. The burden of pretending, the invisible armor of self-doubt, the endless comparing, all of it had started to dissolve. He was not trying to be good or strong or special anymore. He was trying to be real. And being real, he realized, was the purest form of freedom. He stopped for a moment by a small river. The water moved quietly, carrying reflections of the morning light. The current didn't ask the rocks to move aside. It didn't apologize for flowing its own way. It simply moved, steady, clear, unbothered. He smiled softly. That was what it meant to live freely. Not fighting against the flow of life, not controlling where it leads, but moving with it as yourself. The young man thought back to his first meeting with the philosopher. How full of frustration he had been, demanding answers, looking for shortcuts. But the philosopher never handed him a formula for happiness. He only handed him a mirror. And through that mirror, the young man saw his true face for the first time. A face unfiltered by judgment, untouched by expectation. He whispered to himself, I am enough. Even if no one approves, even if no one claps, even if no one understands, I am still enough. The words felt strange on his tongue, but they were soft, real, alive. He realized now that courage isn't about standing tall in front of the world. It's about standing quietly inside yourself, even when the world turns away. It's the ability to live without waiting for permission. In the days that followed, nothing spectacular happened. No one congratulated him. No miracle appeared. The same people walked past him on the streets. Some smiled, some frowned, some didn't notice him at all. But he no longer felt the need to read meaning into their reactions. The world was no longer a mirror he needed to adjust to. It was simply a vast landscape, full of colors, sounds, and lives, each moving to its own rhythm. He began to greet people without fear of being ignored. He began to speak his mind without rehearsing the perfect response. He began to make mistakes and forgive himself quickly. For the first time in years, he could breathe. Weeks later, he returned to the philosopher's house. The small wooden door was open. Inside, the philosopher was sitting by the window, reading quietly. He looked up and smiled as the young man entered. You've come back, he said. The young man nodded. I didn't come for more answers this time. I just wanted to say, thank you. The philosopher closed his book. You don't need to thank me. The courage you found was always yours. The young man hesitated. Will I ever lose it? Only if you forget to listen, said the philosopher. Listen not to others' voices, but to your own. They sat together in silence, the way old friends do when words are no longer needed. After a while, the young man stood. Goodbye, he said softly. The philosopher smiled. Not goodbye, just until we meet again. And with that, the young man stepped out into the morning light. Years passed. The young man grew older. He faced new struggles, new people, new doubts, but the lesson of that quiet night never left him. Every time he felt lost, he remembered. The courage to be disliked is not a single act. It is a daily choice. It is the choice to remain kind, even when others are unkind. To remain honest, even when lies seem easier. To remain yourself, even when the world demands a mask. That choice, small, silent, but steady, becomes a kind of revolution. Not one that changes nations, but one that changes hearts. Because when one person decides to live freely, others notice. They feel the ripple of that freedom. And one by one, hearts begin to open, masks begin to fall, and a gentler world begins to appear. In the end, the young man, now older, calmer, wiser, realized something simple and profound. The goal was never to be perfect. The goal was never to be admired. The goal was to live truthfully, to walk your own path with quiet courage and an open heart. And that, he thought, is enough. The gentle art of being yourself. As the story comes to a close, the world outside is quiet again. The morning sun has turned to afternoon, and in that soft golden light, a truth begins to unfold, slow, peaceful, and certain. We spend so much of our lives searching for love, for purpose, for meaning. We chase approval like a mirage in the desert, believing that if we can only make others happy, we will finally rest. But happiness has never been something we find. It is something we allow. When you stop trying to please the world, you start to feel the rhythm of your own heart. And in that rhythm, there is peace. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady and alive. The courage to be disliked is not a shield against criticism. It is not rebellion, it is grace. It is standing quietly in the middle of chaos and saying, I will not betray myself. It is smiling at your reflection and whispering, I am enough, even when the world forgets to say it. This courage is not taught, it is remembered. Every child is born with it. A child doesn't ask if they're good enough to laugh, to dance, to cry. They simply live. But as we grow, the noise of judgment grows louder. We begin to shrink, to perform, to wear the masks that others hand us. And yet, deep within us, the original self waits, patient, eternal, unbroken. That is the self this journey leads you back to. The philosopher's lesson was never about being brave against the world. It was about being gentle with yourself. To wake each morning and decide, I will not live by fear. I will not be shaped by expectations. I will not measure my worth by someone else's comfort. I will live as I am. Because when you live as yourself, the right people find you. The right moments come to you, and life, quietly, naturally, begins to unfold in your favor. It is not always easy. Sometimes you will walk alone. Sometimes silence will hurt more than rejection. But even then, remember, solitude is not emptiness. It is space where your true self breathes. So take that courage. Carry it gently. Let it guide you through noise and doubt, through failure and growth. The world does not need another person pretending to be perfect. It needs one more person brave enough to be real. And that person could be you. So as this chapter closes, remember the whisper of both journeys. Ikigai, the reason to live, and the courage to be disliked, the freedom to live truly. Between the two, you will find balance, the peace of purpose and the strength of self. And maybe that's all a human being ever really needs. The music of life plays softly in the distance. You breathe, you smile, you walk forward, not to be liked, but to live.